and this is what I plan to do. Here's my outline. I first say something about the literature, then an introduction, and then I'm going to start the main positions in the sense of the positions of general philosophy of science that are mostly used and cited in economics. So you are likely then to stumble upon things like inductivism or falsificationism, deductivism, Karl Popper, or paradigm theory, Thomas Kuhn, or the methodology of scientific research programs, Imre Lakatos. These are the positions, the most important positions of general philosophers of science being discussed in economics. And then at the end, I come to a chapter which orientational paradigms. So this is a term you've never heard in your life. Anyway, so this is the stuff I'm going to talk about. And so I begin with the literature. Right. So the literature is this. All texts are supplementary. I don't expect you to read anything of. I don't. You mustn't. It's not necessary to read it. You are of course allowed and invited to read everything here, but it's not mandatory. So in general philosophy of science, this is a very highly, a very successful book. What is this thing called science? And there are the chapters 1, 4, 7, 8, and 9 cover these positions that I'm discussing here. Then I'm citing two books of mine because there I use them, I cite them because, I've written them and I know them and they are pertinent, right? So one is on Thomas Kuhn and the other one, Systematicity. That you don't know what that has to do with the course, but I'll explain to you, believe me. Then here's another newer introduction to the philosophy of science. Here it's these chapters, just in case you want to read something. Then these books did not cover economics especially. There are some articles and books that build up or discuss the relationship of general philosophy of science to economics. And there is one, for instance, there you see it already in the title, The Rise and Fall of Popper and Lakatos in Economics. You know, Popper and Lakatos, the guys I mentioned before. This is an article then. Here's a book, also an article, Kuhn versus Lakatos, or Paradigm versus Research Programs in the History of Economics. Then a book by Latsis Piero. He's one on the Lakatos camp. You don't see it in the title. Then Phoebe John, Methodology and Economics, a Critical Introduction. Useful book, discusses also these relations, if you want to have something. Then Robbins, I mentioned him already, Lionel Robbins last time, on Latsis Method and Appraisal of Economics, a review essay. And finally, What's Wrong with Economics? I don't know what it is, but it's in that book and it makes the relationship to philosophy of science. Okay. So this is just in case you want to read additional stuff. Now let's start with the things that are important here, the introduction. Note the following points. First, my representations of these positions will be simplified. I mean, if you go to a philosophy institute, then you have a full semester, you know, Popper, a full semester, Lakatos, or whatnot. So it's easy to do that. People even write books on that stuff, on one of these, on these positions. So it will be simplified. And again, as everything else in philosophy, these positions are highly controversial and they partly contradict each other. So they can't all be true, right? Which is bad, but that is life, right? So we try to understand and we don't come to conclusions where everyone can agree. The positions in general philosophy of science come in two main forms. And this is very important if you want to make sense of philosophy of science for economics, that you see the difference between these two forms. One form is, or one group of philosophy of science is that they articulate normative positions. They articulate norms how good science should be practiced. So there are philosophers, they sit at their desk and then they write up how good science should be done, right? Well, it's difficult to say how they do it, but the fact is that they do it. Whether that's successful or not, it's a different story. It's controversial, of course. But there have been these philosophers who sit down and try to find out how should science be done if it reaches its goal, namely truth about nature, whatever, right? So these are normative positions. They describe norms. They say what you should do if you want to be a good scientist. The other positions are descriptive positions, and they give generalized descriptions of existing science. We have again here the same as in economics, between positive economics and normative economics, right? It's exactly the same distinction. And in one case, the descriptive positions describe how science proceeds. So they are somehow generalized. They are not history of science, but generalized descriptions of what science does. And the normative philosophy of science tell you how science should proceed if it wants to reach its goal. And of course, it wants to reach its goal. All right. So this is a distinction which is as important as it is important in economics. It's also important here in philosophy of science. It's important because for various reasons to understand what these people are saying, and especially once you look for the arguments for their claims. Arguments for norms and postulates are different, very different in kind from arguments for descriptive statements, right? Descriptive statements in the end must be tested empirically, right? Whether the description is correct. You describe something and then you got to look at the thing in the description and look whether that's okay. Whereas norms cannot be checked this way because the norm tells you what you should do, right? And then what you've done so far is not the important thing. It's the question, this is what you should do. So that raises several problems. To some of them I will come in a second. All right. So this is the first thing. You have to distinguish, and I will, of course, declare that then to you whether these positions are descriptive or normative. And you should know that because sometimes when people use these positions, then they use, for instance, normative theories in a descriptive sense, and it doesn't really work or creates problems. Now, these positions in general philosophy of science have been developed for the natural sciences, especially physics. So the English term science mostly covers the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, astronomy, biology, geology, etc. Then you may add the term social, and then you are at social sciences. But then you have the other fields, the humanities, right? And in English, the humanities are something completely different from the sciences, from the word. In German, that's different. You have one word. In French, it's also. In Spanish, it's also similar, that the humanities are part of what is then called in German Wissenschaft. And therefore, one has to be careful. So when you read in German, say, about these people, then they seem to write about Wissenschaft, right, about the general thing, including all disciplines, including art history and stuff like that, right? But in fact, when the authors are English speaking, then they mean by science really natural science. And the point is that the philosophy of science is really a philosophy in these authors is mostly a philosophy of natural science and mostly of physics, which is also, again, a restriction because physics isn't everything. Physics is very different from chemistry. It's very different from geology. It's very different from biology, and so on. So physics is not everything, but this is just the case that historically these positions have been developed for the natural science, especially physics. But it is controversial how well they fit physics and even the other natural sciences. So a position may be good for physics, but inappropriate for biology. So a position speaking about the development of science, and then it may be somehow fitting physics, but it may not fit biology. Biology may develop differently, or geology, or other disciplines. So it's not clear. They claim to be general philosophy of science, but it's not clear and controversial whether they really are general or whether they are discussing special cases, more or less appropriately. Now, even if they fit the natural sciences, it is not clear how well they fit the social sciences, especially economics. So once you have a normative philosophy of science that tells you something about science, as an economist you can say, wait a minute, that may fit physics and chemistry or biology, I don't know and I don't care, but even if it fits perfectly, it's not clear that I should take it seriously as an economist, because economics is different, right? And it's not clear that the norms that are good norms for, say, physics or biology or whatever it is, are ipso facto also good norms for economics. So this is not clear, and it has to be discussed, of course. And of course, we'll discuss that. There is massive disagreement about the appropriateness of the positions for economics. And I'm coming to that discussion, when economists discuss these positions that I mentioned, and I'm going to discuss here, then there is big disagreement whether these are positions that are interesting for economics or whether they are more or less irrelevant for economics. I'll come to that in detail. The result is this. If we find discrepancies between any of the philosophical positions and the practice of economics, it is not at all clear how to evaluate these discrepancies. Now, this is a special case of a much more general case that I mentioned in a second. It could be that the normative or descriptive philosophical positions is inadequate or just wrong, or that is not applicable to the social sciences for whatever reasons. So if you have this discrepancy, it could be on the philosophy of science side, it's just not good, right? So therefore, it doesn't fit economics. So that's the culprit. This is where we have to make corrections. Or it could be that a normative philosophical position is basically correct and applicable to the social sciences, but economics does not live up to these demands. It could also be, right? It could be that economics is just done lousily, right? And that you say, look, if these physicists, if they say, oh, well, this is a bad science, right? Doesn't work properly, and we tell you how to do it properly, right? Physicists know everything, so they also know how economics should function, and then they tell you this one. So it is open. If you have a discrepancy between these norms and a certain practice, it is open. What is the reason for the discrepancy and how it should be healed? It's a special case of a general problem that's highly relevant for economics on different counts. If there is a discrepancy between norms and facts, then either the norms or the facts can be wrong in some sense, or both. And it's not a priori clear which one is the case. And that holds everywhere. Whenever we have norms and facts and a discrepancy, it's not clear what should be changed. Now look at, for instance, at Zurich. So it has been introduced very recently in many parts of the city, 30 kilometers as maximum speed. So people behave, in this country, I mean, people do behave properly most of the time. So many people, function properly with this 30 kilometers. Imagine we get even greener or redder or whatever government here in Zurich, and they decide, no, it will be 10 kilometers per hour everywhere in Zurich, right? And then people will violate these norms, I guess, because they won't, they will still drive their cars. It's too important to have a car and drive around with it. And then they deviate from the norm. And then the question is when you say, oh, it's very simple, they are breaking the norm. Other people will say, wait a minute, this norm is absolutely crazy. You can't have a city, and the norm is stupid, right? So the difference is not showing, well, that it's showing, of course, they're breaking the law if the norm went through parliament and so on. But the point is simply, you could also say, but this is a stupid norm, right? Just to give you a historical example, some 40 years in most European countries, or most, I don't know, I know it about Germany, I know it not even about this country. Homosexuality was against the law, right? You were a criminal as a homosexual, right? It was punished, paragraph 175 in Germany. It was, I think, abandoned only in the 90s. And then people thought somehow the tide changed. So in my youth, I mean, it was just, a homosexual, you're a criminal, right? Very simple. And look at some countries, it's still there, right? Now this is very much changed. Now, if you look at, say, international politics, there are really politicians now in prominent positions outing themselves as homosexuals, males and females. No problem anymore. Seems to be accepted. Well, we have slight things sometimes, racistic, whatever. Anyway, so the norm that was accepted 50 years ago in many Western countries as homosexual is a disease or a crime has been changed. And from nowadays point of view is, of course, that these people were punished. There were thousands of tragedies coming out of that. People committing suicide, it was just horrible from today's point of view when you say, well, homosexuality is just different sexual preferences, and people should be free in having the preferences that they have, apart from the fact that it's very hard to influence them. But anyway, so from that point of view, that norm was awfully bad and wrong, right? And from the point of view 50 years ago, this was different, right, for most people. So what you see is that a difference between norms and facts that exists does not give an indication what is wrong. It just tells here is a difference, not more, not less, right? And the question is, the open question is, what should be changed? Should we give up the norm? Should we change the norm? Or is it that indeed, say for instance, when people drive with 150 in the city or 120, like sometimes younger people, mostly male, then using a nice hot BMW or an Audi, they drive around in the city, right, 120, there it seems to us obvious that this is really a violation of the norm where the facts should be changed. And that we have 50 in the city or 60, it used to be 60, that seems to be, well, worldwide seems to be almost, well, worldwide I can't judge, but in many countries people agree to that, right, 50 or 60 in the cities. So the norm is accepted and right, so someone deviating from the norm should be punished. So the point simply is, and we have that problem in economics very strongly, because of that use of normative premises, right, of premises that can be used normatively, like theory of rationality, is also used for descriptive purposes. And therefore we have in economics this tension between the normative elements and descriptive elements. And again, I warn you, it is a priori always open if there is a tension, what is right or what should be corrected. This is open, a priori. Then you may find good arguments why this or that should be corrected, but a priori, but even both can be wrong, right? All right, so if people behave irrationally according to some norm of rationality, either they may indeed be acting irrationally, or the norms that set the standard for rationality are inadequate, or the norms are misapplied. So if you think, well, I know what rationality is, and then you say, oh, how irrational are you? But it may be that your theory of rationality is wrong, right? Too strict or too special or whatever. Or you may make mistakes in application. Even there's no, I was quite surprised, even decision theory. There's a philosopher now in Constance who says that decision theory, standard, absolute standard utility maximization, is not the correct normative theory for rationality. He claims that. I haven't seen the arguments in detail, but even that is not forever, right, for good. It may be that someone says, no, these norms are not the maximum of rationality. Okay, this is wonderful because I'm exactly at the end of this introduction, so I wish you a wonderful week and hope I'll see you next week again.